We're crossing the bridge now to enter the Yamada Island, Morikami Museum and Gardens. We will be entering the Yamada Museum, where there's an excellent exhibit of the early Japanese settlers who came here in the early 20th century, and we will be reviewing that exhibit in this video. So walk with me as we approach the entrance and admire the architecture of this building. The story of the Japanese settlers here in Yamada, as it is known at the time, begins here. We are looking here at Jsu Chi, age 29, upon his graduation from NYU, where he did a degree in finances. He had the idea of coming here to Florida to start a Japanese colony. Some of the people that were very instrumental in helping him would first be James Ingram, who was the president of a model land company connected with the Florida East Coast Railroad, and the governor of Florida at that time, who was Governor William Jennings. Both enthusiastically endorsed the idea of starting a Japanese colony here, believing that the Japanese would bring new crops, help commerce, and bring innovative farming techniques. We're now looking here at a large photograph of the early pioneers who came here. Unfortunately, not all of them have been able to be identified, but here at the bottom we have Jsu Chi in the center. And so as we step back, these are the very first settlers, brave, single Japanese men who came here and ventured here from Japan. We'll continue to learn a little bit more about the Yamada colony here as we go through this display, which today is located in what is called Yamata-kan. Jsu Chi comes from the town of Maizu, and here we're seeing a picture of the castle of that town. This photograph was probably dated, or how the castle possibly looked in 1872. Today, Maizu is the sister of Delray Beach, and many exchanges occur between the two towns. When the Japanese settlers first came here to this area, they were promised a piece of land, a parcel of land. However, the land had not yet been drained, so they took over another plantation, and what we're looking at here is by 1906 they started to develop their first crops, which were primarily a variety of vegetables and pineapple. And the area that they eventually were able to settle on was the Keystone Plantation in Wyman, which is between Boca Raton and Delray. They eventually changed the name from Wyman to Yamada. When the settlers came here, they didn't need to take a train. They usually embarked on a ship in northern part of Florida, and they took the railroad coming down here. Now, the original railroad station in Yamada, but as you can see here, they did have a stop here, and they did name that train station Yamada. And that photograph we're looking at, it was possibly taken in 1910. We're looking here at another photograph or reproduction of a photograph of Jsu Chi, who established his colony eventually. He did come down here earlier, but he established his colony a year later in 1905, and as noted, at that time it was the Keystone Plantation, and we eventually changed the name to Yamada, which first appeared in print in 1905 in an issue of the Japanese American Commercial Weekly that was written in the Japanese language. The first time that name appeared in English was a little bit later, a year later, in 1906 in the West Palm Beach Tropical Sun. We're looking here at a portrait of primarily the person that helped to finance this colony, Mr. Okai, who was very wealthy and was a silk merchant in Japan. And he helped Jsu Chi with financing the transportation of the Japanese settlers. He did come here himself. He left his wife and family behind in Japan, and he did come here to Yamada Unfortunately, he died 2 years later of malaria, so he never returned to Japan to see his family again. Below him is a portrait of Jsu Chi's younger brother, who also came here and was very successful in the colony and eventually became one of the earliest landowners, and he was actually the head of 6 outfits or groups that formed the colonies. We're now looking at another successful settler that came here. This is Count Okudari. He was the son of a lord of one of the titles of the royal, well, people believe based on his name having count that he was connected to Japan's imperial family, but that was really not actually the case. We're looking here at some other early settlers. And we'll continue through. The most famous settler of all, of course, is George Murakami. And the land we're standing on, we owe to George Morikami. He was not one of the original people to come here. He did not come until the colony was already established, and he arrived here in 1906. This is an early portrait of him. And here we see a later portrait of him. And he was the only settler who remained here through the decades. And it was in 1977 that the museum opened. He passed a year before, but he donated his land to Palm Beach County with the promise that it become a public facility to be enjoyed by the people. We're looking here at a photograph of Jsu Chi. He returned to Japan. He was in an arranged marriage, and this is his wife, Seda, that we're looking at. Here, of course, he's dressed in a kimono, as are the other people at their wedding ceremony. Seda eventually returned here to Yamada with the Joe, and they raised their family here, and we are going to take some look at some of the children of the family. Here we see Jsu Chi and his wife and their 3 children. Okay, we're now looking at a portrait of Jsu Chi's younger brother who came here and settled, and I am now going to be showing you some pictures of his family and his children. This is a portrait that we're looking at of Jsu Chi's brother's family, his wife, and his children. And of course, Jsu Chi's goal was to have families that would settle here and have children and remain here. Of course, that dream was never quite fulfilled, but there were some children that were born here, as we can see here, looking at these young children. When we come up close, we can see one of the young children born right here. There was here at the Yamato colony a school that went from grades kindergarten to 8th grade, and as you're looking at this photograph, you can notice there are children of different ethnicities. Those children who graduated 8th grade and did continue on did attend Delray High School. And here's an example of one graduate from Delray High School who eventually went on to earn a degree. She is the daughter of Jsu Chi's younger brother. Jsu Chi did have difficulty recruiting families from Japan to come here to Yamada, so he did try to get some of the Japanese people that were living in the New York area to come here. Now, some of those people were married to people that were not necessarily Japanese, as you can see here. And the family, the husband and wife looking at it here, was the first family to join in 1905. And they did have a child that was born here in Yamada in 1906. We're now taking a look at some of the photographs here in the Yamato-kan that tell us a little bit more about daily life and celebrations of the Yamada colony. Now, the people that settled here did not necessarily celebrate holidays, but they did participate every year in the July 4th Independence Day Parade in downtown Delray. Notice a large tomato, which is one of the very successful winter crops that the Yamada settlers grew here in this region. One of the activities was group meetings down here at the beach, as photographed here. Here we see one of the Japanese settlers on horseback. The settlers sometimes went out into the woods west of the area and hunted. Here we see one of the settlers in a car, and note that cars really were available in this area before they were in Japan. Here we see Seda Sakai with her 3 children. They are dressed in kimonos, However, the Japanese settlers here did not ordinarily wear kimonos. She dressed her children in the kimonos in Japanese style for a special event. And it was only during rare visits to Japan that the children and Mrs. Sakai would wear the kimonos. Although Jsu Chi's goal here at Yamada was to have families maintained here and stay here for generations, only one couple was actually married here. And this, in a wedding ceremony, this is in 1931, we're looking at that couple. By that time, Jsu Chi unfortunately had passed away and was not obviously at the ceremony. Right along that wedding photo is a portrait of Jsu Chi at the time of his death, August 21, 1923, and he died here of tuberculosis. One of the factors that contributed to the decline of the Yamada colony during the 1920s was the land boom here in Florida. So those Japanese settlers who did manage to own land were tempted to sell their land. And so these are some advertisements that we were looking at. There was an attempt to set up another Japanese colony here in Florida. This would be significantly later than the one here at Yamada. However, those plans fell through. There was quite a bit of political complications, and a good number of the Floridians had some objections to that. In addition to the land boom of the 1920s, a hurricane occurred here in this area in 1928, which was another contributing factor to the decline of the Yamada colony. The real downfall of the Japanese colony, of course, occurred during World War II, and here we see a news article about it. And at that time, although the Japanese were not sent to internment camps, they did have to give up their land. And the United States government had them secluded and kept them under eye, so to speak. So they didn't have the liberty to move around very much. Eventually, the land that they were on was occupied by the United States government to set up a military base here. This signage here is the collapse of the Yamada colony in the 1940s, when the Japanese settlers here were forced to vacate their land, and the United States federal government created here an Army Air Corps technical training facility. When we first approach here the Yamada Museum, we have this wonderful plaque dedicated to George Morikami. And I'm going to come up close and show you his face at his older age. George Morikami was born November 7th, 1886 and died February 29th, 1976. The plaque tells us Mr. Morikami arrived in the United States from Japan in 1906 at the age of 20 to work as a pineapple farmer. He was one of the last surviving members of the Yamada colony, a settlement of Japanese families that lived west of Delray Beach at the turn of the century. He worked as a farmer all of his life, gradually acquiring some 185 acres of woods and farmland. In 1966, he donated 40 acres of land to the state of Florida to be used as an agricultural research station. In 1974, he donated 40 acres to the colony to be used as a park and a site for the museum. He eventually donated another 100 acres to be included in the park. This unique museum of Japanese history and the beautiful surroundings of the Murakami Park stands as a rich cultural inheritance from George Murakami and a fitting tribute to his memory. I'm now going to stand back so you can see the whole plaque. And I'm just going to do a quick pan of the Yamada Museum. If you were to enter any of these rooms, you would see Japanese culture through the eyes of a children. And the exhibit is called Japan Through the Eyes of a Child. Okay, we are now ending our tour of the Yamada Museum with the focus on the Japanese settlers who came here to establish the Yamada colony.